Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to It's Okay Until It's Not. This week's podcast, we are going to be demystifying trauma. Jamie and I have had a lot of requests around trauma, which I think makes a lot of sense. Collectively, individually, we're all dealing with trauma on some level. So we are excited to talk about this. And as Jamie and I were getting into this new subject, we realized this is probably not going to be covered in just one podcast, but in a series of podcasts.
Right. Yeah. The fire alarms are going on again. It's not that loud, so it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think people hear the word trauma and I feel like they think they don't have it, for general population. I feel like just because they haven't been in World War II, that they don't experience trauma, because I think it's been overglorified in a way that, trauma is war vets, or trauma is something extremely devastating. So I took it upon myself, because I know it to be a little different. I haven't been in said those extreme circumstances, but I also know that I've experienced trauma. And so I needed to bridge this gap for myself, and also now for the people who might be listening. So I looked up the definition, just so we can start from this very clean, understandable slate. And the definition itself says trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. It does not discriminate, and it is pervasive throughout the world. Thought that was fair enough. It is also not just psychological, it is also physical. Because my entire most of my schooling is about the physical body. When you have an injury, it's considered trauma of some sort, whether it's acute or whether it's, chronic, that there's trauma on the body. And the most interesting thing is that the body processes both of those things no different. So whether you've experienced a psychological trauma or a physical trauma, the body holds and stores it the same way. Yeah.
I remember when I had my C-section, the first one, and they just left me in a room by myself, and my body was shaking just nonstop, kind of like when you have the chills, when you're shivering. And I was shivering nonstop. So I called on the call button and I told the nurse, I said, I think I'm cold. I don't really feel cold, but I can't stop shaking. She's like, oh, that's okay. Your body's just in shock. You're waiting for a blood transfusion. That's why you're in here. And you're just going through shock. I was like, oh, okay, then. I guess
that's
I'll just...
okay, she said. Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. You're just in shock. And that's my favorite story about sharing what physical trauma does to our body. Sometimes we can't even, I literally couldn't even control or stop the shaking at all.
The okay is that is a natural response to trauma. However, it doesn't mean that it's okay. That will turn into, potentially could turn into so many things later, because we didn't address it head on when we experienced the trauma to begin with. So I think a nice bridge also to this is from trauma is calling it, we could just call it stress, because people brush over stress. Like even doctors now are saying, and nothing against them, but they're saying normal stress. Well, there's really no such thing, because in the definition that I read, the word cope is in there. So we do and can endure a lot of things in our human life, but there's a point where the body no longer can cope with the amount. And for some reason, I think people get this gold star or badge because they can claim to having so much stress in their life and that they're still alive. I'm not certain that that's the Medal of Honor that we should be seeking. I think that, the coping mechanisms that we end up using at that point they'll also add to our stress and our traumas, because we're not actually seeking the point of support or acknowledgement, which we'll probably get into in a little bit anyway. But so if we address this as stress, I can think of times where, like, I've talked to people and said, if you're driving in the car and there's traffic and you acknowledge that the tips of your fingers are tingling because you have grip on the steering wheel so tightly, and your shoulders are up in your ear and your butt cheeks are clenched, or a lot of people I know like curl their toes under on the non-gas or brake foot, and they're pressing it into the floorboard with this self-preservation tool of how to get through traffic just to get to a work that has a lot of onset of trauma or stress there too, because you've deadlines and bosses and coworkers, and like it's just one rolling ball after another, where I can't imagine anybody could deny having trauma in their life, right?
Right. I think it's different degrees. And I think when the doctors are saying normal or everyday, I think they're just talking about, I take it as more common traumas. So the more common traumas would be traffic or getting in an argument with your spouse. Those are traumatic because sometimes an argument, and we all deal with them differently, but some can leave us unable to sleep, which also then creates even more trauma because then we're sleep deprived. But then there's traumas that aren't so much every day that everybody experiences, like being gang raped. Or, for example, my nurse, one traumatic event that I watched him for years just brush under the rug was he was jumped, I guess it was, for being gay. A hate crime. I'm sorry, I was lost at words there, but basically jumped for a hate crime and left on the street to die and just, beat up. That is very, very traumatic. It's definitely not every day, but I definitely think all those little everyday ones that we cope with, or we brush under the rug, or we deal with by drinking or smoking, or however it is that we deal with it, that then adds more trauma, they build up to then add one great big trauma, right? So we all have trauma in our lives, no matter what.
Right. So if anybody were to ask you who has trauma, I venture to say the answer is everybody. And so, like, here's another boiled down, is that if you have been birthed and if you've given birth, both are traumas. Like, to be birthed is very traumatic. Like, it just is. And then, of course, the person who's doing the birthing is also physically, probably emotionally traumatized as well by the experience. There's a lot.
I was. Oh, yes. I was. I mean, I have to tell you, I was panicked. The whole thing. They told me I had to have a C-section, which meant a shot in my spine, which instantly, I mean, I was shortness of breath. I was seeing little spots and I was like, I just don't know. And then, it turned out I had scoliosis. So it took 4 shots to numb my spines, four in my spine. I was just like, I can't even believe this is happening right now. I can't believe I'm sitting still for this. Then we went in and I was so scared to feel anything, to know that you're going to be cut open and awake. I was so scared to feel anything that when they would ask me if I felt something, I kind of kept saying yes, even though I know it was just pressure. But I wanted to make sure I was really numb. Well, because of that, they overnumbed me and I couldn't feel myself breathe. So at all, nothing. I couldn't even feel, like I couldn't feel breaths coming in my chest. So I was like, I'm dying, just so you guys know, like, I don't think I'm breathing over here. You're going to have to intubate me.
I'm only allowed to get over, and I know you and you lived through it, but that's crazy.
I know. I just, that's one lesson on about being honest, right? Like, be honest.
It's a whole other podcast.
Yes. Can have a big trickle effect. So yes, very, very traumatic for me, the giving birth part. And I know that whenever you bring that up, any woman that has given birth immediately has to share their story. I've witnessed that. I'm sure you have, because it is so dramatic. Yeah, even the easy ones are.
I have a friend who moved and changed my life by her birth story. It was her first child. She's a recovering addict. She had dealt with a lot of her own demons and traumas of her past. And the day that she gave birth, she chose to do it naturally. And luckily for her, she got to execute it naturally. But she said that it came to a point, because her husband was great to her and doing all of the great, giving her shakes when she wanted it and rubbing her back and doing all of the things. And it came to that point where you can't turn back, right? Kids coming out. And
you can't suck them back in.
Right. And there's at a point where nobody can do anything for you. It's just you, your kid, and that moment. And you have to go through it. And she moved me I was on my knees in tears with her experience, that she re-saw all of her demons and traumas that she'd been to up to that point with her addictions and all of the stuff that led her to choose addictions. And she said she had to fight every one of those like a damn warrior in the midst of like this birthing canal. And I was so moved by it. I'm not saying that she's free and clear of those experiences, seeing that her past come before her again, but she certainly knew that there was a threshold met by giving birth to this first child. It was the most incredible thing I've ever heard. Crazy.
Yeah,
I was like, I don't know if I want to do it this way if I had a child, or if I want to run completely the other direction from that. But
yeah, no, there's no way. I know that I just don't think I never had a choice, other than C-section, because in my third came so soon after I hadn't healed for my first C-section, so they wouldn't even let me do a natural. But I don't know that I would have chose to do it naturally. I feel like I would have chose comfort,
right?
Some amount of it, but yes. But the point is that we all have trauma, and we all have our stories, and we all have trauma that we are brushing under the rug. I dare say, I'm sure some of you will be like, no. But if we became present with it and really thought about every day, I mean, speaking of, like, look at my trauma from yesterday.
Wow. I know those of you listening to this can't see it, but Laura and I were at dinner, and she said she had burnt herself while cooking, and the way it looked yesterday and the way it looks right now, if you're not watching this, it's healing, but it looks terrible at the same time.
It looks terrible. It doesn't hurt anymore, thank God.
Right. So it's about the pain, I guess what you're saying.
Right. And so sometimes when it's just physical, but then what emotions come up with the physical? Yeah. And Jamie brought up a good point to me last night. It's a story I think even worth sharing if you want to, but about how there was trauma that happening before this emerged on my body, right? And that trauma was causing me to be here, and here, and not present with what I was doing and being fully present in that moment, which for me, trauma very much can look like scatteredness.
Yeah, it's disassociation, I think, to some degree. I mean, there's, again, degrees, as I said, there's lots of them where it's just, you've got your direction is pulled constantly because of your children and their needs, etc., your own needs, your husband's, your family, not to mention all the things in life, right? Whatever is on the TV, or this is fairly normal. But when you're pulled in so many directions, that the one thing that is requiring your attention, and this time it was a pot, full of what you were cooking. But sometimes if you look at that as an analogy, it could be one of your kids. It could be your spouse, not you necessarily, Laura, but just saying, like, anybody listening, is that for her at this particular moment, it's the pot needed her attention. It's hot, it's boiling, and it got the best of her for a moment. Pay attention to me. And that was its way of screaming out, saying, you're distracted and I require your attention right now. Everybody can wait. I wanted to say before we moved on real fast, is because we're talking birthing, and sometimes people can't identify with traumas or understand why their traumas exist. And there is such a thing called epigenetics. And epigenetics says, without getting into all of the science, is that it's a transmitted through birth, being birthed, that you are experiencing traumas that your mom, and quite possibly through understanding the science, their mom's traumas are within you as well. So sometimes when you can't put a finger on why am I feeling this way, or why am I doing this, or why is this bothering me, at an emotional level that it doesn't seem to make sense, is quite often it's not yours, but because it's presenting itself to you, in this moment, it's yours to address, not blaming the mother that carried you and the mother that carried her. There is trace that it's 7 generations back that we can carry trauma from, but specifically the egg of your mother is in your grandmother. Your egg that's in your mother is also in your grandmother at the time of conception, 100% certain. So the best part about this is that it's not in our DNA. It doesn't come through as unchangeable. It's very malleable. The way it comes through as an epigenetics is that it can be altered. So once we recognize it and say, oh, I feel something, I'm having anxiety over something, or I'm having whatever, that it doesn't need to be pinpointed sometimes of what it is, but the fact that it is, and you could be the place where this trauma stops, period, dot end. I know that in my own life that I'm the end of a lot of generational stuff, just based on my heritage. I understand that I don't fall into a lot of these categories, and that it stops with me. So I think it's interesting how we can, like, while you were pregnant with any one of your kids and you experienced stress at any certain time, that cellular response to the stress was also absorbed by the child that you were carrying.
Mm-hmm.
It's not blame.
Absolutely.
It just is.
And I think that as some of you that have been listening to us for a while, this may be your first time, but my son Jackson has been labeled and on the autism spectrum. And I was pregnant with Jackson when my first son, William, suffered from a brain injury. And I've always saw the correlation. To me, it made sense immediately. But what was really reaffirming to me was when a speech pathologist went and saw a couple doctors speak in Phoenix about this, and it was called in utero trauma as well. And this is where you're taking on the stress of your mother. So if your mother had experienced some type of trauma, whether physical or emotionally, while she was pregnant with you, you also are taking on all that, the stress hormones, the extra cortisol that you're releasing, and depending on where she's at in her birth, and you're taking, or where she's at in her pregnancy with you, you're taking on that trauma. And that just made so much sense to me with Jackson, because everybody that has worked with him after so many months, they all say he doesn't really present like a child with autism. And I'm thinking, yes, well, I went through a very traumatic event while I was pregnant with Jackson. So in that way, it was almost like another brain injury for him, but in a different way, than what William, my oldest son, had.
Yeah. It just is, right? Like, so for anybody to think that they don't have trauma, we have to reconsider it. And then once we understand that we can reconsider that trauma does exist in all beings, what do you do with it? And if we use children and animals as an example, children, I find, because I've worked with quite a few recently, more recently than not, that they are holding on to their traumas longer than they ever have before, and they're absorbing them and they're making them their own than they did a long time ago. But there's his name just eluded me. There's a scientist that was doing trauma work and understanding, and he was in war-torn countries, and he was in a bunker, and he was watching what happened to a group of people. It's a study of adults, children, and animals inside of a bunker while there was bombs being dropped within feet from them, and to watch what they did as a response. The children and the animals literally shook it off and went about their day. Period. The adults, on the other hand, absorbed the trauma. They went into what looked like more of a fetal position. It's a very protective position for the body, is to shelter the organs, heart, lungs, most specifically, but to move into this very protective shape. And then they owned it and held on to it. And then it's now probably, I'm sure they sought help because they were part of the study, but they didn't let it go to move through it. And I think that's the shift in understanding, right? Like I have experienced a trauma. So I'm going to say this because quite often when we experience trauma psychologically, that we have choices. So I'm a child of divorce, and I've heard and read through studies is that when parents will tell you through a divorce, this isn't your fault, we're not divorcing because of you, that no matter what, quite often a child of a certain age and younger makes that assumption, because to own that as their truth, instead of not knowing who to blame, or what, not, it's a terrible word, but like who to trust about their foundational life. Because if they own that it's their fault, that creates some sort of belief and some sort of foundation to live from, that there's a belief system, instead of like ambiguously trusting into universe at such a young age, because they want some grounding, they want some. So it's easier, it's more healthy, for lack of a better term, to believe this crazy thing that although your parents are telling you it's not, to keep you safe, to move forward from. So, insert 20 years later where they're struggling with some things, because they all don't show up the same, but it can root back to thinking that they were to blame for their parents' divorce. But at that point, it was the safest thing that they could choose. So it's a coping mechanism, but at the same time, it also needs to be seen and addressed, which we'll talk about, in order to move forward, because it's inhibiting them in their life future, ahead. So these choices we make will become the foundations for us to shift into greater things later if we see them, because they're going to inhibit us eventually. They're just not going to be truth anymore,
Right. And it's interesting how some traumas really do hold us back, and they literally change the lens. They change the way we view and see the world. And some we do kind of brush off, even as adults or even as children. And just because something may have happened to me and I was able to brush it off, it may happen to my neighbor and she's unable to brush it off. So I think it's really important to remember that when you are reviewing your life, when you're saying, what has happened to me, pay attention to the first thoughts, the first things that come up, because they're coming up for a reason, and don't compare yourself to anybody else's story.
Right.
At all, because it may not be traumatic for you that was traumatic for your neighbor or your friend.
Right. I remember my brother dealing, and we have the same parents and we're quite a few years apart, but I remember him struggling with something. I was in my 20s and I was like, why is this bothering him so bad? Like my gut was like, I have so done this already. Like, why is this bothering him? That's what a 20-year-old would do.
Yeah.
But then I was like, this is his journey. This is his hurdle.
Right.
This is his struggle, and it's up for him to figure that out. And I have just because we're the same parents and we were in the same house, our perspective of that life was not the same at all.
And neither were the tools that you use to
correct.
deal with it
Right.
the same at all. My brother, my sister, and I, if you were to ask each one of us in a separate room about my parents' divorce, we would all have a completely different story on how it affected us, on the way we viewed it. The whole thing would be completely different, which would be a really fun study actually to do.
Yeah, I agree.
With somebody. It'd be interesting.
One of my things that I've wanted to do for a very long time is, because my mom and her siblings are, they don't speak. I haven't spoke to my brother in almost 5 years. I'd love to sit with the siblings and just get perspective, my own, like my brother, and just get his perspective. Even if he wants to tell me that he thinks that I was the favorite child, which I think had gone around for so long, and let me hear it. Like, what was your opinion of this? Like, Laura, you and I were at dinner together last night, and you and I probably have two very different stories and experiences, and we were at the same place sitting right next to each other. But if I looked, to the left of the room and you looked to the right of the room, you had a completely different experience than I did. You know what I mean?
Do you agree that we were at a teppanyaki grill?
We were there.
Okay.
At least we have a solid foundation.
Okay.
Yes, we were there. So I'd say quite a few, like if we were to say, where does trauma like stem from, or like there's childhood trauma, right? That, inevitable or not, it exists. This isn't blaming our parents ever. And if you are in a place of blaming your parents, this is the part where, if you're hearing this, that maybe you switch the perspective from blame to understanding, to compassion, to holding space for that, because even if they did quote unquote bad by society's standards, they probably did very best that they could. I haven't met a parent yet that said, or been around one yet that said that they are intentionally trying to hurt, their children. But at the time, that was their resources, and hindsight's always 20/20. So if it's a childhood thing, and we start by holding the space for the parents to be
and learn more about it, because like you were saying, I can't remember the word you used, but your grandma and your mom, they may have been carrying some trauma as well that you took on unknowingly, and they may not have known, but just by being able to look back and say, oh, this was their past. Like my great grandmother, for example, came over and had nothing. She didn't even have a bathroom. And then as she was getting older and losing her mind a little bit, we couldn't keep her from using the bathroom in the front yard because she was so used to picking cotton. Literally, she lived in Missouri. She was so used to working in the fields and picking cotton, and they would just pull up their skirt and urinate anywhere. Yeah, and as she got older, she started doing that again. So I think it's interesting to even just review a little bit if some things are coming up for you that make no sense at all.
Yeah. I think that, sometimes there are not people left to answer the questions, if the generation has passed before us that we haven't had an opportunity to speak to them. There's just that it's acknowledging. So I guess the summary of that is if it's showing itself through you as discomfort, as unsettled, as disassociated, as
making poor choices, who we're in a relationship with, what we're allowing to happen.
So like most people understand that, or it's been like that common understanding that we pick people like our parents, right? So like women typically date men like their dads. If they're in the house or whatever it is, they make the same choices because it's convenient. And I don't mean convenient. It is comfortable. It's understandable. Like I always say, women set up their kitchens like their mothers too, because we spend 18 years of our life-ish running around a kitchen that's set up a certain way. So you also bring that trait into your own home, but that's probably never going to push back on you. And I did it. I dated somebody just like my father, many of them, and nothing against him. It's just not, I knew deep down, because I kept getting, like I was like, oh, this is familiar. And then I would be in the relationship going, but it also doesn't feel good either. So familiar and doesn't feel good. And they were warring. And so I had to say, I know something greater for me exists. And this is one of those bonds that I know that I'm breaking, because my mother married somebody just like her father. And it perplexed her, because even after she left him, I think the people that she had dated also felt just like my father. And,
and maybe we're still learning a lesson there, and then it becomes uncomfortable enough and you finally see it. And then it's like, okay, so then what do we do with it? Which is a whole nother podcast, how to leave an unhealthy relationship. But because that definitely can cause a lot of trauma for men and women. I think I honestly don't know one person that has not been in a traumatic, unhealthy relationship.
And everything I hear about that is when you have the ability to look at it, not out of hate or disdain for the person that you're in a relationship with, like it was their fault that they treated you badly. It was, there's a pattern that's understood. It's that it also helps you understand what you don't want or like or need.
Yeah, it helps you understand yourself, and it helps you to heal from some of those traumas, childhood traumas, for sure.
I feel like there's only one. Somebody said, where did I see it? That there's a billion failed relationships in order to get to the one that doesn't, right? Like, but they're as failed, it just means that there's an end to them, that you can have a new beginning with someone else. Take what you learned from this as trial, as a sports-specific training, and then move it into the next relationship, so you know that
Right.
you
But
know?
don't perpetuate the trauma. Don't keep feeding it by staying longer or trying to fix something that's broke. Take the
Mm-hmm.
lessons from it and then move to what you deserve. And I think so much of that comes down to what we do deserve, what we do want, and getting
Let's
to know ourselves better.
And let's also say that just because we're saying it as a relationship in intimacy, an intimate
Friendships,
relationship, but
yeah.
friendships, exactly.
Yeah.
And right, even parents, is that you and I talked about this last night, right? Like there is a pattern that you set up with everybody. The minute you step into relationship with anybody, which is um, even your food servers, like if you greet your food server immediately with some shitty
Mm-hmm.
response to whatever, then you've immediately set the tone for how your relationship, what kind of food service you're going to get. So if you look at your friendships, like I probably told the story at a previous podcast, but I have a girlfriend, there's a triangle friend, right? So I have a friend, and then we also have a mutual friend. And the mutual friend um, was talking to me and said that this other friend, A and B, treats her like shit. And I said, she didn't treat me like shit. Like she would never talk to me like that. And she would tell me the way. And I thought to myself, well, this is one of those um, places of understanding that when they first met, when they first established their relationship, that there was some form of acceptance into, yes, I'm allowing you to treat me like shit
Yeah.
forever, because that was what I agreed to, whatever that was. And I was like, I did. And I joke and I say, well, Jeffrey Dahmer didn't eat everybody. Like people were shocked and appalled that they heard that this guy had done those things, is because they established a different relationship. As egregious as that example is, it's true. You know, there's always that one person in any murder story anywhere whatsoever that says they truly can't believe it. And sometimes it's not denial. They're not in denial. They just have a completely different relationship with him, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's a
I
great
should have saw the
example.
signs.
Right. Right. I should have felt the signs. But I think that's a really good point in bringing up on, and then how do we start to then deal with our trauma? So we start to see our trauma, we start to feel what is really impacting our lives now, because I wouldn't get bogged down and overwhelmed with all the different trauma. Again, I would say, what is coming up for me now? And whatever's the
Yeah.
first things that come to your mind, it's coming to the forefront for a reason and to be addressed, to be looked at. And so, what do we do with it? What do we do with it? You know,
What do
for
we do?
example, one of the girls that wanted us to talk about the trauma, several of them are in unhealthy relationships,
Right.
and that's very traumatic. And that kind of trauma is, what's the word I'm looking for, it's every day just feeding and building, so it is changing, really, in essence, who you are. It'll take quite a bit of healing from once you can move on from the relationship for the next step, which is why I think people are encouraged to take a bit of time out in between.
Yeah.
So how do you start to heal from that?
Well, first you have to feel it. Like
Mm-hmm.
sit in it and feel it. I think that you and I talked about this last night too, is that that's probably the biggest step that probably most people miss, is that, you can self-help book yourself to death and read about stories and whatnot that people have lived through such traumas, but you have to literally sit in it.
You can't
Also,
numb it. And I think it's important to say that numbing can be even just scrolling through social media. It can be
yes,
reading books. It
yes,
can be going out with your friends. It can even be making lists and keeping yourself busy. So when we say sit with it, we mean completely your presence is 100% with that, and not just one time. Okay, well, I sat with it. Not much came up for me. But even carving out a little bit of time each day to sit with your experience and to even journal about it, but giving it the same amount of attention as you would somebody when you first start dating them. Because if you want to truly heal from something, you have to give it that much attention. And I don't know anybody, I'm at fault as well, that has ever given that much attention to something I want to heal, because it hurts. And so more often than not, I'd rather just be like, okay, I'm done with that now, moving on to the next thing that feels good, rather than sitting and dealing with this thing that doesn't feel good.
Right. And those polarities must exist. Mm-hmm. So the amount of highs that you seek, you have to experience the low. Otherwise, it will probably bury you. I wish I had my friend here to tell this story with me, because I was in my shit in the moment. And we were supposed to be talking. He was a teacher training student, and I said, I can't do this in quiet right now. So you're going to come with me. The Golden Knights were in their first season, and people were going wild crazy. We went to a loud ass bar, and I sat in this booth with my friend and trainee and went through the motions of sitting with. It's crazy because I needed the noise, because nobody was paying attention to me, right? And I was literally in upheaval. I purged and witnessed so much. Like I go, ooh, I got another wave coming again. And he was like, okay. And I was like, it's coming. And I was like, I'll tell you all about it. I just started to like diarrhea of the mouth of what I was experiencing, and tears would pour, and like, you know, the server would come up and I would, yeah, I'm fine. Just bring in some potato skins, whatever. I don't know what it was, but and then it would come as a wave and it would go. Mm-hmm. And I think what happens a lot is when people say sit in it, like we just did, is that what in it is uncomfortable. And I don't know what your uncomfortable is, but it's uncomfortable. It will make you anxious. It'll make you sweat. It'll make you want to puke. All of those things, but it's temporary. And I can tell you right now today that I am a far better person because I just sat and watched all of this shit come up. And it was like, oh, and then I kept saying, and this will pass, and this will pass. This can't be forever. And it does. And it did. And it wasn't even the entire game. I got to like love the third period because I was through it. I was like, oh, the Knights won. It was great.
Yeah. And you had somebody to sit with you. And I think that's super powerful. Both are powerful, sitting and stuff by yourself and with somebody else. And sometimes I find that being able to sit with somebody else that you trust and that can actually just be present with you, but not try to fix it, is really powerful, because sometimes just the right question or just feeling that amount of security that you're not alone helps you to dive just that much deeper. You know, so I think it's really powerful if you can to find somebody to help you to support in sitting with it. Again, bringing us back to last night, you know, we talked a lot about how to know the light, you have to know the darkness. And the deeper you go into the darkness, the darker it is, but the brighter the light seems. So just reminding yourself of that when you are sitting with your trauma and whatever that may be, that there is that light at the end of the tunnel.
There is. I used to do all of my self-discovery work and being in tears alone up until this was probably a pivotal point for me. I don't know that I shared that experience with anybody, any of my relationships, because I didn't want them to judge me or think I was a Looney Tune. And then I realized that that's not a real relationship, and this person I wasn't in relationship with, so I didn't fear to lose anything, but he was opposite sex. And it just taught me that I was able to be, you know, everything I need to be, not judged and held space for, and found compassion by, and that I could go through my process, which probably turned things around for me in relationship, because now it's the full Monty.
It's the real Jamie.
It's the real deal.
It's the real Jamie. But do we want anybody in our lives that we can't be real with? And that has been a big learning experience for me as well. Probably many men and women out there that we do hold back our true selves, our healing experience, holding back from really diving in there deep for being judged as a Looney Tunes. And so that can really hold us back on our healing process.
Yeah. I wanted to share, you had said something earlier about these ways of coping, and I find it quite funny. I coped, I grew up in Vegas, and the joke was, keep your daughter off the pole, where I very much had a life in childhood that I could have chose that. And to be frank, there's nothing wrong with it. I just chose to seek education. I got really smart to cover up my wounds. And because I'm really smart, I understand. So for those of you listening who just want to read self-help books and educate yourself around these traumas, is that just because you're smart about it doesn't mean that it's going to make your experience any less experiential. I don't want to say good or bad, because that's, that's a judgment that's not necessary, but I can smart my way around all of this. I know the answers to all of these things, and through school, through books, through working with people, but until you have to be in it. You
have to experience it.
So it's almost better if you've never read anything about your self-help. It's so much better when you come into this blind, because you don't know what to
just
expect.
Like I say with the crystal books, when people first start working with crystals, I'm like, please don't look at the books yet. Experience it first. And then the books will make so much more sense to you.
Yeah.
You'll connect with it.
Brilliant. Yeah. So if you do read the books, I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying it's time to apply. You could be a good student, or you can be a good person. And I want you to be a good person. So take your education, as I would say if I was doing yoga, take it off the mat and start living this. Be in it. It will forever transform you in such positive way, and you'll be more resilient and have so much more capacity when you start ridding yourself, or at least observing the stuff that binds you to the past, or not creating a more fulfilled future because you're stuck. Like, all of these things will open up. And I think part of the resistance is not knowing what's coming, but when you create space from being bound to past trauma happens in the past experiences, that it's only up from there. Like, you have to trust that part of the process, that it's only up, that it's, if you don't like what you're getting, you gotta change. You gotta do something different in order to get something different. That's insanity, right?
Yeah, totally. You cannot outsmart an experience. There's no way around it. You can't dumb down an experience either. I've been on both ends of the spectrum, and you can't dumb it down to avoid it, and you can't outsmart it. The only way is through, for sure. And getting some help along the way with that, whatever that looks like for you, whether that's professional help or a good friend. But I definitely think having the supports when you're going through a trauma, no matter how big or small, really just being able to hear yourself alone is very healing, to have it reflected back to you.
Fully agree.
Well, good. Fully agree.
That's why we're here.
So I do have a few crystal recommendations if we're at that point yet. Okay.
Let's do it.
So the first one that came to me that I've used, and if I look down, it's because I'm deciding which crystal to share with you first, but I don't know that I have shared this one yet. And I know some of you are just listening. So if you're listening and you can't see this video, Google this one, Lepidolite.
That's so pretty.
Lepidolite, Lepidolite. Very, very beautiful. And of course, it can be polished down to a stone, a round stone, to also be able to wear it. Lepidolite.
What she's showing is raw. It's a raw
Yes,
cut.
what I'm showing is raw, and it's beautiful. It has mica in it, so it's very reflective. It has also lithium in it, the mineral lithium in it. And so that's why I like to recommend really actually wearing this one. I do keep this in my space, especially my meditation space. I keep this piece, but it's a great one to wear when you're doing some deep healing work, because you'll absorb the energy from it. It's very, very calming, and it helps you to deal with those past traumas that you're working to heal. So that is the one I really wanted to first recommend if I had to narrow it down to one, but I do have a few others.
Okay. I was going to say, a lot of people who we've heard from experience anxiety as their response to a trauma.
Yes.
And anxiety is a future-based emotion or feeling. It comes because of fear of the future. Yeah. And so to be grounded by a stone in the process, because they come from the earth, first of all, but this specific stone or these specific stones are probably rooted in a deep grounding so that your feet are always on the ground regardless of what experience you might
and
be
which
feeling.
Is why sometimes I like to mix and match some as well. So lepidolite is from the earth, so just that alone can be grounding, but some stones, as you know, are much more higher chakra, higher elevation, releasing that energy,
vibration,
which I believe lepidolite is. It does very much help with anxiety because of the lithium base, but it's connected more in healing in our heart center. For grounding, I like black tourmaline because it can be heavy. So as soon as you hold it, it instantly does feel grounding. It brings you more in the present moment, but it also helps to release the traumas. So I think these two actually work really well together when meditating, of going into your heart and spending and being present with your feelings, but knowing that you're safe to do so. Being in the present moment and grounded, knowing that you're feeling them right here. You're not in this traumatic experience at this moment. At this moment, you're safe.
Yeah, that's so good. I was thinking that when people release anything, right, there's space left. And space is an absence of space is absence of something, which can cause anxiety just by having space. So there's this, I always used to end, and you might have heard this in a previous podcast, but I always would end my workshops or some yoga classes with, because you're so spacious after yoga, everybody feels great. And it's quite often the shavasana or the rest at the end that is that grounding element to the high. But from the practice, you have space within the mind and space also within the body. Because as I said in the beginning of this podcast, is that the body holds trauma no differently from mental or psychological traumas as physical trauma. So if you've released a tight hamstring, or you cried perhaps because of something emotional that might have come up, that the space is the same. And now that you have space, you have 3 choices of what to do with it. You can fill it with the same shit, fill it with different shit, or keep it spacious. And the hardest one to do is keeping it spacious, because especially if you're unfamiliar with spaciousness, it feels like so much could happen there. So perhaps that's not the first thing you shoot for, is to continually be spacious all the time. But understanding that you have choices, that you can go from making the same one over and over and over again to filling your space with something a little bit different. I'm not saying choose. Some people go from vice to vice, where they're filling their spaces like from one addiction to another addiction to numb, but perhaps it's going from something that was once an addiction to something more healthy, less void filling, and more nurturing, self-loving. And those are the shifts. And then from self-loving, you start to enjoy and practice being spacious more often. And maybe if it's for a moment, it's not your entire life. That's almost impossible.
But the practice will bring so much more consciousness to that choice. So by having the practice, that alone will help you to hopefully not keep filling the space with either a different addiction or the same addiction. It may help you to make a different choice and then get a little bit more comfortable with the space.
And let's be clear that addiction that we just used as so ambiguous is quite possibly the bad relationship that you're in. You're addicted to the bad relationship,
or the list. The constant list, the constant need to be busy can also be an addiction. And then you start to burn yourself. And it's just very traumatic. And it says, wake up and practice what you preach, which was last week's podcast. So if you need that, go back and listen to last week's podcast.
I'm Tourmaline, black tourmaline, just saying.
Black tourmaline and lepidolite are huge ones that I would recommend. The other one is Rhodochrosite, which I'm showing you right now.
I love it.
Can also be in a bead, and it's beautiful. It has it's helping you to go into your heart. So if you don't have black tourmaline or lepidolite, Rhodochrosite is a little bit on the pricier side and harder to get a hold of, but not impossible by any means. I have some actually on my site right now. It really helps you to go into your heart space in a grounded way. So if you are listening to this and you're thinking, why is she not recommending rose quartz, which is the most readily available, most known heart chakra, just popular crystal in general? Because I feel that when you're ready to do trauma work, you need some extra support when going into your heart, not just blasting it open with a quartz-based crystal that is super expansive, but going in tenderly with a little bit more care and with intent.
Yeah, that's great advice, because that would be reckless otherwise, right?
Just reckless. It'd be like driving down the highway at 100 miles per hour, the wrong direction, getting ready to smear your emotions all over the place to people that possibly don't care and can make it even worse for you.
Yeah.
So how's that for an analogy?
Yeah. But yeah. I think it needs to be coined and put on some sort of, I don't know, shareable meme, I think.
So rhodochrosite for sure. And then another one is amazonite. So helping you to go into your heart, but also how do you express it? How do you get it out? So connecting the heart and the throat space together. And by expressing it, it could mean just writing it down. It could mean expressing it to somebody that you trust and that you feel safe with. It could mean screaming in a pillow to release the energy, but just opening up the throat, opening it up and helping it to expand. Yeah. So I think it's important that we express and to also listen, you know.
Also to speak truth to yourself.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. Don't lie to yourself.
Right. A turning point to my healing journey, which I know is coming up on a podcast soon, was to openly admit that I was having these terrible thoughts out loud, to hear it to myself so I could take responsibility for it. And that too created a huge shift in my experience. Was like, I don't want to talk to myself like this. Like, this is bananas, because when it's in your head, it's safe and you believe it and it's just is. And then when you say it out loud, something happens. So it doesn't necessarily need
becomes
to be
a little
anybody.
Bit more real.
Yeah. Right? It doesn't need to be to anybody. And then I started to admit it to other people and then take responsibility for that too.
And now you're ready to talk about it on a podcast.
Yeah.
So there's that trickle effect of the healing though. You have to just start and start where you're at with what you can. But I promise you'll feel so much better. Even if your start is totally unsuccessful, you'll be so proud of yourself for starting.
Yeah. And
just
I think
for starting.
This
and
unsuccessful,
I know right. Yeah. What does that even mean? But what I'm saying is, in your mind, you might say, I don't feel better. Yeah. And then so you may coin that as unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. So just reminding yourself, but you started. There's a trickle effect. And so you started that and keep building upon that until you do start to feel some of the shifts. Mm-hmm. Which actually brings me to my next one. I pulled out several today, but Carnelian I did because I feel that this process needs to be fun. It doesn't need to feel so burdensome. It doesn't need to be cookie cutter either. You know, get creative with yourself. Make a collage, make a vision board, doodle out your feelings. It doesn't need to be a certain way, you know. Tap into your sacral chakra, move beforehand or move it out, dance, punch something, scream, but just get creative and playful and remember that we're all here and deserve to feel joy. We deserve to feel joy and happiness in our lives, and we don't need our traumas to control our life.
Right. Because that's quite often the thing that's keeping us from it. That's great
Absolutely.
advice.
Thank you. So those are my, let's see, we did lepidolite, black tourmaline, rhodochrosite, amazonite, and carnelian are the 5 crystal choices. And of course, as I always say, if something else resonates with you, it's speaking to you for a reason. So pick that up and then look it up. Pick it up and look it up.
Yeah, that's our rule of thumb when picking bracelets with you.
With everything, right? With everything. Before you get too in your head, stay in here and then go in there. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we'll stop this one here as to demystify this idea of trauma. And then our follow-up will be more specifics, perhaps, the more specific traumas.
And what you'd like to hear?
Yeah, that
let
we're
us
getting
know.
questions about. So we leave it up to you to share what you'd like to hear. That's that, huh?
That's that. Until next time.
Until next time. See you.
Bye.